How's it going, everyone? Today we will be discussing how the body balances the levels of water and fluids in our body, how it balances electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and chloride, and also how it manages the acid-base balance within. And so we'll be discussing that and discussing how the body balances blood pH, or the level of hydrogen ions within our blood. The body is made up of around 55 to 60% fluids, and the two components of these fluids are either inside of the cell, what we call intracellular fluid, or surrounding the cell. And so some of that extracellular fluid is the interstitial fluid, which is in between cells, and then we also include blood plasma, which is the other type of extracellular fluid. Here we can see total body mass, and males are going to have 60% fluid and 40% solid, while females holding on to more body fat are going to have a ratio more like 55% fluid to 45% solid. That fluid within our bodies, 2/3 of it is intracellular fluid, the fluid inside of the cells, while the rest of it is extracellular fluid. And the breakdown of extracellular fluid is 80% of that is going to be interstitial in between these cells, and then 20% of that extracellular fluid is the blood plasma. We will lose and gain water every single day, and obviously we gain water through the liquids that we ingest and the foods that we eat. But in addition, a small amount of water is made through metabolism. Remember, when we bring hydrogens and oxygen to the electron transport chain to make ATP, another byproduct of that is water. So that's some of that water gain we get every single day. We lose water through urination, and so that's how we lose most of it. We also lose a lot through the skin as well, epidermal, so water loss through that skin, and then through our lungs as well. When we exhale out, it's not only CO2, it's H2O, and then we also lose some of that water excreting it through the GI tract. So when we are dehydrated, or even when we are just not consuming water in a long time, that's going to impact our fluid levels. And our brain, in order to make sure that we are balancing that amount of water in our bodies, is going to activate a thirst response. So there are a few different stimuli that are impacted when you haven't had water in a long time. One, your blood osmolarity, or the amount of solutes per solvent. In this case, our solvent would be blood plasma. So when that osmolarity increases, it's going to activate this thirst response. In addition, decreased blood volume, right, is going to also mean decreased blood pressure as well. So these two pathways, and also just having a dry mouth. If you haven't consumed liquid in a long time, these four are going to be different stimuli that basically all activate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, when these thirst centers are activated, that increases our thirst. We're going to ingest more water, and then that's going to help us balance these fluid levels. The kidney is able to regulate these water levels through a few different hormones. We discussed them in the last lecture: antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and another one called atrial natriuretic peptide. This one's actually released by the atrium, but does affect water regulation at the kidney. The release of antidiuretic hormone is going to be very similar to what we just discussed in the thirst response, meaning that stimuli like increased blood osmolarity, decreased blood volume, and decreased blood pressure are going to lead to the release of ADH by the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary gland. And so what antidiuretic hormone actually does is affects the nephron and the late distal tubules and the collecting ducts that we discussed in the last lecture. And what happens is these become more permeable to water. And so what happens there is that increases water reabsorption. And so, if we are low blood volume, this is going to be able to restore some of that blood volume by reabsorbing more water from the nephron, and that will in turn decrease blood osmolarity and increase blood volume and pressure. We discussed aldosterone as well, and this is going to increase the reabsorption of sodium And then water reabsorption is going to accompany that sodium reabsorption. Remember, the movement of water is going to be heavily tied with the movement of ions. So aldosterone helps with the reabsorption of sodium. That increases water reabsorption, and then that helps to balance our fluid volume and fluid pressure within our bodies. So again, atrial natriuretic peptide is actually released by the atria. And so when we are collecting blood from the rest of the body, it is going to go in our atria. And so if we have an increase in blood volume, that is going to increase the stretch because there's more blood coming into these chambers. And so once that occurs, this is basically a signal then for the atrium to release ANP. And then what that does is increases the excretion of sodium ions. And since we're excreting sodium ions, then water will also, again, move with those sodium ions, and we're going to get rid of more sodium, more water, aka produce more urine, and that's going to lower our blood volume and blood pressure. So antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, they are increasing blood volume, blood pressure by increasing fluid volume or water volume. And then the atrial natriuretic peptide, that is decreasing fluid volume, decreasing blood volume, decreasing blood pressure. Many of you have probably heard of the term electrolyte from numerous Gatorade and Powerade commercials, but may not have ever known what that means. And basically, electrolytes are just ions that are found within our body fluids. And so they have many important functions, including maintaining the osmosis of water, because again, the movement of water is going to go with the movement of ions. And so that's how we're able to get water in and out of certain compartments within our bodies. It helps to maintain the acid-base balance. A lot of times they may act as buffers, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. They carry electrical current. We talked about the heart, the skeletal muscle tissue, and the nervous tissue. They are all going to use these ions in order to carry out certain functions. And then they also serve as enzyme cofactors. Remember that these are going to be materials that help enzymes function properly. So again, electrolytes are very important, and that's why if you lose a lot of electrolytes, it can have devastating consequences, even fatal. And so, it's always about relaying this back to our field, exercise science and sports. It's always important, that we're not losing too much electrolytes during hard workouts, and that if we are, that we are replacing them in order to maintain function in our bodies. Here we could see the levels of cations and anions inside of the body. Remember that cations are positively charged and anions are negatively charged. So the most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid is sodium. And so it actually accounts for half of the extracellular osmolarity. So it's going to be the most abundant of the electrolytes in, again, our extracellular fluid. And it plays a role in action potentials, which we discussed, depolarization in the nervous tissue and the muscle tissue. It's going to be started with sodium moving into the cell during an action potential. Concentrations are going to be controlled by antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone, and atrial natriuretic peptide. Again, so we are either going to be increasing sodium levels in the blood by decreasing excretion or urination, and also we can lower sodium levels in the blood by reversing. Chloride is the most abundant anion in the extracellular fluid. It moves across cells through leakage channels and is heavily used to balance the charge or the anion levels in different fluids. Potassium is the most abundant cation in the intracellular fluid, and that's why it plays a role in action potentials in repolarization. So when its channels open, it typically moves from inside of the cell where it's most abundant to the outside where it's least abundant, and that helps to manage the membrane potentials. Bicarbonate is going to be a buffer for hydrogen ions, and it's also how, again, we are able to transport most of the carbon dioxide throughout our bodies. Calcium is mostly stored in our bones, and it's going to be regulated by hormones like parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, and it's also a major signaling molecule, such as is the case in neurotransmitter release. We are going to rely on those calcium ions to activate certain proteins, and that it's going to help with vesicle movement towards the presynaptic membrane and eventually release those neurotransmitters. Phosphate is another important buffer in our acid-base balance, which we'll be discussing here in a second. And then magnesium suffers as a cofactor to many enzymes. And again, in order to keep the homeostasis, to keep the functions of the body normal, we need to balance these electrolytes. Acid-base balance is very important in our bodies, and we need to keep a constant monitoring on the level of hydrogen ions within the bodily fluids. This level of hydrogen ions is called, again, pH, and so changes in pH can affect cellular function. It can impact protein structure. And so we are constantly either using buffers or, using the level of air that we breathe or urine that we excrete, or reabsorption of certain materials. We're doing all of these things in order to maintain that pH. And the pH that our body is trying to maintain is a level of 7.4. So again, we use a few different systems in order to manage pH. The first one, a buffer system, is using buffers that bind to hydrogen ions, and this will thus increase pH because now there's less hydrogen ions floating around because they've had a buffer to basically manage their levels. We also get rid of hydrogen ions by exhaling. Remember, whatever leaves with CO2, or what leaves with CO2, is H2O. And so if we are getting rid of more hydrogen ions that way, that is going to reduce carbonic acid. That's going to reduce the amount of hydrogens and oxygens that can then combine with CO2 to make carbonic acid, and that's going to increase, again, pH. We also get rid of hydrogen through our kidney excretion. This is one of the slower mechanisms because it takes so long to build up those urine levels and then eventually excrete it. But it is the only other way to eliminate these acids from the body. Other than through carbonic acid, and by excreting out more hydrogen, we increase pH. We can balance hydrogen by a protein buffer system, and a protein buffer example is hemoglobin. And so we've discussed this actually in the past, that hydrogen will bind to hemoglobin, and that actually will reduce the amount of hydrogens in the blood. And so if you reduce the amount of hydrogens in the blood, that increases pH. Another buffer that we have is bicarbonate, and we've already discussed that. So if we are able to increase bicarbonate levels in the blood, then we are able to, have more hydrogen bind to bicarbonate, and that's going to produce more carbonic acid. That, again, serves as a buffer because you're lowering the levels of hydrogen ions in the blood. Phosphate is a buffer that can be used within our cells. So we know about phosphate through the cleaving of ATP and the release of energy, but also that phosphate, which is a major anion, can be used to balance out our hydrogen levels within these cells. And so by attracting more hydrogen ions, you can see this monohydrogen phosphate, a weak base, is able to buffer some of these hydrogens, and then you get a product of dihydrogen phosphate. And again, by making this reaction, we are reducing the level of hydrogen ions, thus increasing the pH within our cell. We know that as we exhale out more CO2, there is also more water that is released. And those waters are H2O molecules. So the more water that we get rid of, the more hydrogen ions that we're getting rid of. And since we're getting rid of more hydrogen ions, then our blood pH is going to go up, right? So, if we have a decrease in blood pH, which again means that there is an increase in the hydrogen concentration within our blood, that's going to trigger chemoreceptors within our medulla and within our aortic and carotid bodies, and that is going to send action potential signals to the respiratory group and the medulla to start to increase that depth of breathing, right? And so what's going to happen is that as we exhale more, well, then we are getting less carbonic acid forming within the blood and fewer hydrogen ions that are present because we're getting rid of more of it. And so when we get rid of more hydrogen, we are increasing blood pH, right? Less is in the blood pH is going to increase. And that's how we affect our acid-base balance via our respiratory system. We can see here in the kidneys that we can take water and carbon dioxide, again, make this carbonic acid, and that leads to the splitting of this hydrogen, and now we have bicarbonate, which can be reabsorbed into the blood that could help buffer pH there. But we can also get rid of this hydrogen through the urinary system. And so in order to do that, hydrogen is pumped through into the nephron here, into the lumen, and then it's going to bind. And it could either bind with amines that you could see here, or that can bind with phosphate, and that's how we get dihydrogen phosphate. And so both of these different ways are ways to buffer it within the urine, and that's how we're going to eventually get rid of some of this hydrogen content in our body. When blood pH becomes abnormal, it either can become too acidic, which is called acidosis, or too basic, and that's called alkalosis. And so in the body, when blood pH drops below 7.35, that's when we are considered acidosis, right? And then when it rises, when it becomes more basic, above 7.45, that's what we determine as alkalosis. So again, we like a pretty narrow range as far as pH is concerned. The body works its very hardest to balance out and buffer certain materials to keep our blood pH around 7.4. And if we deviate even just a little bit, we either get alkalytic or more acid blood. Acidosis can occur either through the respiratory system or through the metabolic system. Respiratory is going to be when you are hypoventilating. And this can occur if you have a certain disease like COPD, emphysema, bronchitis, asthma. If you're not getting enough movement of air, then that's going to lead to built up CO2 levels, and that means you're going to also have high hydrogen ion content because you're not able to get rid of those hydrogens, and that in turn decreases blood pH. Another way we can develop acidosis is through the metabolic pathway, either through extreme diarrhea or accumulation of acids. Such occurs with ketoacidosis, a lot of times a negative side effect of many types of medication, and then also just dysfunction in the kidneys. And so whichever mechanism here, it typically means that you have a loss of bicarbonate. And if you are losing more bicarbonate, that means you have less buffer. Less buffer means that you have more hydrogen ions that can accumulate. And again, we accumulate more hydrogens, that decreases blood pH, otherwise known as acidosis. Alkalosis is going to be the opposite. If it's alkalosis that occurs because of the respiratory system, it's because we are hyperventilating. Oftentimes, this can occur when we are in a very shocked state. So you tend to hyperventilate, and this is going to cause since you're hyperventilating, you're getting rid of more CO2. And the more CO2 we're getting rid of, that means lower CO2 levels inside and lower, thus consequentially, hydrogen ions. And so this alkalosis can occur through hyperventilation, and it also can occur through metabolic pathways. So vomiting, endocrine disorders, or excessive intake of something like antacids, which are going to buffer hydrogens. This is going to cause either hydrogen levels to decrease in the blood or bicarbonate levels to increase. And either way, we get an end product of an increased pH, otherwise known as alkalosis. Luckily, if alkalosis or acidosis occurs, the body can manipulate the other system in order to adjust blood pH. So if we had hyperventilation and there was respiratory alkalosis going on, well, then we can use the renal system in order to adjust blood pH. So in response to hyperventilation, let's say, or one of these other conditions like pulmonary disease, the body can compensate by decreasing the excretion of hydrogen or decreasing the reabsorption of bicarbonate, which would help to lower blood pH. So we're using both the respiratory system and the renal system in order to balance our acid bases and in order to adjust blood pH. So that's it. That's how the body is able to regulate different fluid levels, electrolyte levels, and hydrogen levels. We use our respiratory pathway, our renal pathway, our skin, our digestion. All these different systems and pathways are going to help us balance these fluids, these electrolytes, and the level of hydrogens within our body. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next lecture.